On April 29, 2014, the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester prepared for a routine execution, at least as routine as the taking of a human life by the state could be. The man scheduled to die was Clayton Lockett, a 38-year-old convicted of murder, kidnapping, and assault in the 1999 killing of 19-year-old Stephanie Neiman. After years of appeals, legal battles, and denials of clemency, Lockett's name was set for the gurney. For prison officials, this was supposed to be just another day in the grim calendar of capital punishment. Instead, what unfolded inside the death chamber would send shockwaves through the United States and reignite one of the most heated debates in modern legal and ethical history. The execution was scheduled for the evening. Witnesses, including reporters and victims' family members, were escorted into the chamber. Lockett was strapped to the gurney, his arms extended, as medical staff began preparing the 4 lines that would deliver the lethal cocktail of drugs. The procedure was expected to follow the protocol that Oklahoma had recently adopted, a 3-drug sequence designed to sedate, paralyze, and finally stop the heart. But there was already tension in the air, because this was not the standard formula used in past decades. Due to growing restrictions on pharmaceutical exports and the refusal of many manufacturers to supply drugs for executions, states like Oklahoma had begun experimenting with alternative drug combinations instead of the well-tested sodium thiopental or pentobarbital that had once been staples of lethal injection. The state planned to use midazolam, a sedative, as the first drug. This would be followed by vecuronium bromide, a paralytic agent, and potassium chloride, which causes cardiac arrest. Critics had long warned that midazolam was unreliable as an anesthetic in high-stress medical settings and might not be strong enough to prevent excruciating pain during an execution. Oklahoma officials, however, insisted it would work. That night, they would put those assurances to the test. From the start, complications rose. Medical staff struggled to find a suitable vein in Lockett's arms and legs. After multiple failed attempts, they inserted a line into his groin area, a rare and difficult procedure even in hospitals, let alone in the dim, tense setting of an execution chamber. It took nearly an hour just to establish the line, and by then, the scheduled start time had already passed. Witnesses noted the visible frustration of officials and the restless shifting of Lockett on the gurney. Finally, the warden gave the signal to begin. The first drug, midazolam, was pushed into the line. The sedative was supposed to render Lockett unconscious within minutes, ensuring he felt nothing as the other drugs flowed through his body. At first, he appeared to relax, his eyes fluttering shut. Officials announced to the witnesses that he was unconscious, and the process moved forward. The second and third drugs followed, setting in motion what was supposed to be a swift and painless death. But just minutes later, the chamber descended into chaos. Lockett began to move. He opened his eyes, lifted his head from the gurney, and began to writhe. Witnesses reported that he moaned, clenched his teeth, and even tried to speak. His body shook and strained against the straps. It became horrifyingly clear that he was not unconscious, not insensate, but fully experiencing what was happening to him. Some describe his movements as resembling someone in agony, gasping and attempting to rise. Journalists present noted that the blinds covering the chamber's windows were quickly lowered, cutting off the view of what was happening inside. Behind the closed blinds, the scene grew more desperate. The execution team realized the line had collapsed or failed, meaning the drugs had not entered his bloodstream properly. Instead, they had seeped into the surrounding tissue, leading to unpredictable absorption and leaving Lockett partially awake and suffering. For 43 minutes, witnesses could hear him groaning and straining before prison officials announced that the executio had been halted due to complications. Yet before they could intervene further, Lockett suffered a massive heart attack and was pronounced dead at 7:06 p.m. The botched execution immediately drew national and international condemnation. Questions swirled. How could such a failure happen in a modern penal system? Why had the state chosen to use an untested combination of drugs? And why was the procedure carried out by personnel who seemed unprepared for such complications? Even more disturbing was the secrecy that had surrounded the sourcing of the drugs. Oklahoma, like many other states, had passed laws shielding the identities of suppliers to prevent public backlash and boycotts. This secrecy, critics argued, meant there was no accountability or guarantee of the drug's safety or effectiveness. The horrific spectacle also brought renewed focus on the broader issue of lethal injection in America. When it was first introduced in the late 1970s, lethal injection was promoted as a more humane, clinical alternative to the electric chair or gas chamber. The image of a prisoner quietly drifting to sleep before their heart stopped was meant to reassure both the public and the courts that the death penalty could be carried out without cruelty. But by 2014, with pharmaceutical companies refusing to cooperate, states were improvising with drug combinations never intended for executions. The veneer of medical precision had begun to crumble, and Clayton Lockett's execution ripped it apart for all to see. In the hours and days that followed, legal challenges multiplied. Lockett's case was cited in emergency filings before courts across the country, as death row inmates argued that lethal injection posed an unconstitutional risk of cruel and unusual punishment. Even President Barack Obama weighed in, calling the incident deeply troubling and ordering the Department of Justice to review how executions were carried out. International observers compared the event to torture, and human rights organizations demanded an immediate moratorium on capital punishment. Oklahoma, embarrassed and shaken, announced that it would suspend executions temporarily to review its protocols, yet the damage had already been done. The sight of a condemned man writhing, gasping, and dying in prolonged agony shattered the illusion of lethal injection as a peaceful, clinical procedure. For many, it exposed the reality that capital punishment, no matter the method, is inherently brutal and fraught with a risk of failure. By the end of the week, the story of Clayton Lockett had become more than just a local scandal. It had become a symbol of secrecy, improvisation, and the dangers of a justice system more concerned with appearances than with humanity. His death raised questions not only about Oklahoma's practices, but about the entire philosophy of the death penalty in a society that claimed to value dignity, rights, and fairness. In the days following Clayton Lockett's botched execution, the state of Oklahoma scrambled to explain itself. Officials insisted that everything had been done according to procedure, and that the failure was an isolated incident. Yet the images and testimonies from that night painted a far darker picture. Journalists who had been present described a man writhing in agony, groaning, and visibly attempting to resist the process of death. For opponents of capital punishment, it was the ultimate proof of what they had long argued, that the death penalty was not only flawed, but cruel, degrading, and impossible to sanitize. The legal fallout was immediate. Defense attorneys across the United States cited Lockett's case in their motions, arguing that the Eighth Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment was violated. Oklahoma faced lawsuits over its secrecy laws, which shielded the identities of drug suppliers and execution teams. Critics claimed that this secrecy eliminated accountability, allowing states to experiment on prisoners with untested substances. One federal judge compared the situation to human experimentation, highlighting that condemned inmates had effectively become unwilling test subjects in the pursuit of maintaining capital punishment. Internationally, the reaction was even harsher. Human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch condemned the execution as torture. The United Nations Human Rights Committee raised questions about whether the United States was in violation of international treaties against cruel and degrading punishment. European governments, already strict about preventing their pharmaceuticals from being used in executions, renewed pressure on American states to abandon lethal injection altogether. The spectacle in Oklahoma had turned into a global embarrassment within Oklahoma. Governor Mary Fallin ordered an independent review of the procedures, though critics argued it was more about damage control than genuine reform. The review confirmed that the foreline had been improperly placed, causing the drugs to infiltrate Lockett's tissue instead of his bloodstream. It also admitted that the execution team lacked the training necessary for such a complex procedure. Despite this, the state announced that it would continue pursuing executions, with promises of revised training and better oversight. For many, this was not enough. The damage to Oklahoma's credibility was irreversible. The controversy also drew attention to the drug midazolam itself. Medical experts testified in subsequent cases that midazolam was not capable of producing the deep level of unconsciousness required for surgery, let alone the violent pain of a lethal injection cocktail. Witnesses recalled that even after high doses, patients could become aware and feel extreme sensations. After Lockett, several courts began reviewing whether midazolam should be allowed at all in executions. The issue reached the U.S. Supreme Court in 2015 in the case Glossop v. Gross, in which Oklahoma inmates challenged the use of midazolam as unconstitutional. By a narrow 5-4 vote, the court upheld its use, but the bitterly divided opinions highlighted just how unsettled the issue remained. Meanwhile, Clayton Lockett himself became a grim symbol in the history of American executions. His name was invoked in debates not only about lethal injection, but about the death penalty itself. Scholars and activists pointed out the irony that lethal injection had been designed in the 1970s to be a humane alternative, free of the spectacle of the electric chair or the brutality of the gas chamber. But what happened in Oklahoma revealed that lethal injection could be just as gruesome, just hidden behind medicalized language and drawn curtains. The controversy even influenced how states approached their death chambers. Some legislatures considered bringing back older methods, arguing that they were at least quicker and more reliable. Utah reintroduced the firing squad as an option. Tennessee authorized the electric chair for cases where lethal injection drugs were unavailable. The image of Clayton Lockett gasping for air on the gurney pushed many states into a reckoning. If lethal injection could not be guaranteed to work, was it truly more humane than the alternatives it had replaced? For the families of victims, the debate was complicated. Stephanie Neiman's family, who had lost their daughter in a brutal crime, insisted that Lockett's death did not erase their suffering. Some expressed frustration that the botched execution shifted the focus away from the original crime and onto the perpetrator as suffering. Yet for others, the image of prolonged torture, even of a convicted murderer, raised moral questions about what justice truly meant. Could a system that inflicted visible agony ever claim to be fair? Or was it perpetuating the very cruelty it sought to punish? By 2015 and 2016, several states had issued moratoriums on executions. Citing the fallout from Oklahoma, courts blocked executions when midazolam was in the protocol. Drug companies tightened restrictions even further, making it nearly impossible for states to acquire lethal injection chemicals. The execution chamber, once hidden from public view, had become a front-page controversy, with Clayton Lockett at the center. Even years later, his case remains a turning point in the modern death penalty debate. It is cited in textbooks, documentaries, and legal opinions as a defining example of why executions can never truly be humane. For abolitionists, it is proof that the death penalty belongs to a past era, not a modern justice system. For supporters, it became a symbol of the difficulties of carrying out a sentence in a world where the tools to do so were vanishing. The haunting images of April 29, 2014, remind us that behind every execution is not only a condemned prisoner, but a society grappling with the limits of justice. Clayton Lockett's final moments revealed those limits in the starkest possible way. A state that sought to present death as sterile and orderly instead exposed the raw, undeniable truth. That execution is violence, no matter how it is dressed up, and so his name endures, not simply as a criminal punished, but as a flashpoint in America's long struggle with capital punishment. A night meant to bring closure instead opened a wound that has yet to fully heal. If you want to continue exploring more shocking and controversial stories of executions, punishments, and the dark side of history, make sure to subscribe, share this video with others, and let me know in the comments what other topics you'd like to see uncovered. History is not just about triumphs and achievements. It is also about confronting the grim realities that shape the world we live in today.